Hello, children, and welcome to Kids Story Time. Our story for today is again about Moses, and today we're going to be doing a story about how Moses flees from Egypt. So, in the last story, we saw about how Moses was born and how his mom hid him, and how he ended up, getting into the palace of Pharaoh and grew up as, one of Pharaoh's children. He grew up in the palace of Pharaoh. So today we're going to see how Moses flees Egypt. We're going to see about the circumstance around it, and we're going to see how Moses responds to what happens around him. So the story today can be found in again Exodus chapter 2. I would encourage children to go ahead and go through the passage. It's a very short passage in Exodus chapter 2. Definitely go there and read the passage in the scriptures. So as usual, we're going to watch a short video, and after the video, we're going to go into a few questions. So here's the video.
Moses was a very young child when he was taken from the care of his mother to live in the royal courts of Egypt. Although raised a prince, he would never forget the family to which he was born. Moses was a Hebrew, the special people of God's promises. The faith of the Hebrews remained in Moses' heart even as he grew up surrounded with all the power, riches, and pleasures that Egypt had to offer. 40 years passed, and Moses grew from a boy into a man. But even though he was raised in the Egyptian way of trusting riches, horses, and chariots, God continued to draw Moses' thoughts away from Egypt and toward his fellow Hebrews. One day, he went out to see his people who were forced to work as slaves. The things he saw were terrible, including an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. When Moses saw this, it broke his heart and filled him with anger. It was as if this man were attacking his own brother. Moses waited until he thought no one was watching. Then he charged toward the Egyptian, killed him, and buried his body in the sand. But as Moses would soon find out, someone had seen him, and word of his crime spread quickly. The next day, Moses went out to his people again, but this time he saw two Hebrews fighting with each other. In disbelief, he confronted them. "Men, you are brothers. Why do you hurt each other in this way?" One of them replied, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was terrified. Everyone knew his awful secret. Meanwhile, Pharaoh was furious when he heard what Moses had done. By defending a Hebrew slave over an Egyptian taskmaster, Moses had rebelled against Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh ordered that Moses be captured and killed immediately. But Moses had already fled far away into the wilderness. Moses left Egypt behind. But this was just the beginning of his story. Moses ran for his life until he came to a place called Midian, where he rested at a community well. 7 women arrived at the well to get water, but they were driven away by a band of rival shepherds. Moses sprang into action to defend the sisters. He quickly defeated the shepherds, then helped the girls water their flock of sheep. When Jethro, the girls' father, heard about what Moses had done, he insisted that Moses be brought home and given a hero's welcome. Over the next 40 years, Moses would find a new home in the land of Midian and in the household of Jethro. In time, Jethro gave one of his daughters to Moses as a bride, and Moses started a family. As the years passed, Moses would learn humility and the strength of a good shepherd. When the time was just right, God would call upon Moses to lead one of the greatest deliverance stories ever.
All right. Our first question for today's story is, why did Moses kill an Egyptian slave master? We would have seen this in the video that we just saw. So go ahead, pause the video and come up with your answer, and then you can go ahead and resume it. Right. So we see that Moses, who was, one of the rulers, or, one of the, powerful men in Egypt, because he grew up in Pharaoh's palace, one day saw how, one of the Egyptian slave masters was hurting another Israelite. And Moses could have just ignored it and gone off. But he knew that, this Israelite that was being beaten was actually a fellow, countryman, or a fellow, family who belonged to the same, nation as Moses did. And he was very upset at what was happening to this, Israelite, at what the Egyptian slave master was doing. And we see that, he quietly gets into this fight and then kills the Egyptian slave master. And it shows us that Moses was not happy at all with the Egyptians ill-treating the Israelites. So that's why he ended up killing the Egyptian slave master. Right, our next question. So as soon as this happens, why did Pharaoh order Moses to be killed? After all, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. He wasn't a commoner, right? So why did Pharaoh order Moses to be killed? Again, pause the video, think of your answers, and again, jump back again. Right, so in Pharaoh's rule, Pharaoh's word was absolute. So if he meant that the Egyptian taskmaster or slave masters could abuse and hurt the Israelites, that meant it was absolutely okay to do that. And in killing this slave master, Moses was revolting against Pharaoh and revolting against Pharaoh's command and decree. And that was certainly a crime that Pharaoh was not willing to tolerate. Even though Moses had grown up in his own palace, Pharaoh was not happy with it. And we see that as a result of what Moses had done, Pharaoh orders Moses to be killed. He orders his men to kill Moses. Right, so as soon as all of this happens, Moses now has to flee for his life, because if he stays in Egypt, he's definitely going to be caught by Pharaoh's soldiers and be killed. So he has to flee, he has to run away and flee from Egypt. So where does Moses flee to? We would have seen it in the video. So think about where he fled to, come up with your answers, and then you can resume the video. Right, so we read again from scriptures that Moses fled Egypt for his life, and he went to a place called Midian. This was probably quite a distance away from Egypt. It would have been a barren place without much of the grandeur of Egypt. It was probably a very a lowly place where people would herd sheep and tend to their flocks. Nothing as grand as the city of Pharaoh, where you had all those grand things to be marveled at. And we see how Moses had to flee to a lowly place, a place which had no prominence, so he could save his life. And that's where Moses ended up going to. So something interesting happens here. We're going to jump into that into the next question. So while he is in Midian, he comes to rest. He's traveled for a long distance. He's so tired, and he sits near a well, probably in the middle of the day. And something happens there. So if you remember from the video, go ahead, pause, the video, and come up with your answers. And once you're done, we can resume the video again. Right. So while Moses is, by the well there, we see that there are a few women. I think it's about 7 women who come to draw water from the well. And when these women come to draw water from the well, there are a few other shepherds who bring their flock as well. And the shepherds, being men, were treating the women pretty rudely. They did not allow them to draw water from the well. they were rude and maybe, wanted to chase the women away and scare them away. And when Moses was seeing all of this, he could have felt to himself, hey, it's okay, I'm a stranger here. I don't want to be involved in trouble here. And he could have just kept quiet, but he didn't do that. When he saw that someone weak, the weak women who are not as strong as the men were being treated badly and were being chased away, Moses came up to defend them. And he actually, stood up and maybe fended off the shepherds. The shepherds maybe eventually had to back down. And as a result of what Moses had done here, these women were able to get some water from the well for their households, for their flock, or for their needs at home. And again, it's a reminder of what we see in Moses. He doesn't sit quiet when injustice is being done. That's the same thing that drove him away from Egypt in the first place. When he sees that his fellow Israelite, his fellow countryman is being, ill-treated, he couldn't stay still. He felt he had to do something. He felt he had to, have it in him to do something strong and do something about it. And it's the same, thing that he does here. He sees these poor, helpless women and decides to act on their problem and help them out. And this eventually leads him to something, interesting. So these 7 women go back home and they tell their dad, we saw this person, he helped us out. So the question here is, who took Moses into his house? Of course, it was the 7, the 7 women's dad. So if you can think about what his name is. So this is the question here. What does, who is the name of the man who took Moses into his house and said, you can stay here. I'm even going to give you a wife. One of my daughters is going to be your wife. So who's that man? Go ahead, pause the video and come back with your answers. Right, so this is the person called Jethro. He's the dad of the 7 women or the 7 daughters. And when he hears about what Moses did for his daughters, saving them from the shepherds, he's so thankful. And he brings Moses into his house and says, you can stay here, you can take care of my sheep. And he even gives one of his daughters in marriage to Moses. So it's amazing to see how the Lord, provides for Moses, this man who was fleeing for his life from Egypt without anything in his pocket. He had no money, he had no possessions, he had no job, he had nothing. And we see how God was faithful to give him a job, as a shepherd, give him a wife, give him a home. And this wasn't probably what Moses would have expected. Had he stayed in Pharaoh's palace, he would have ended up marrying a princess or a queen or someone so rich, and he would have had a lot of pomp and honor and royalty to his name. But the Lord, moves in so mysterious ways that now Moses is, becoming a shepherd. He marries someone who is, not so rich maybe, and, he's in a totally strange and a different place altogether, so different from Egypt. All right, our last question is, we see all along how Moses, when he was in Egypt, even though he knew he was an Israelite, he could have kept quiet to himself. He could have felt, let the Israelites suffer. I'm not suffering. I'm, having a wonderful life in Pharaoh's palace. I'm rich. No one's ill-treating me. I have all the honor, all the pomp, all the riches, and all the fame that anyone could ever ask for. So if my countrymen are being ill-treated, it's not my pain. So why should I be bothered about them? We see that that's not what Moses does. That's not the attitude he has. So why did Moses reject all the wealth and pleasure and conveniences of Pharaoh's palace to end up being, where he is right now in Midian? Think about what your answer is and come back again into the video. Right, so from the beginning, like we know, even though Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, his mom, I believe, played a very important part in teaching him a lot of things. He knew that he did not belong to Pharaoh's palace. He knew that Pharaoh and his household were not his people. He knew that the Israelites were his people. And I believe deep in his heart, he had a sense of reverence for God, of reverence for the God of Israel. I'm sure his mom would have, told him so much about the Lord, told him about, how the Lord had, dealt with his ancestors. And he had a sense of fear and a reverence for God. And like we read in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, we might have, seen this in the earlier story as well. It says that by faith, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He rejected the pleasures of sin and the treasures of Egypt. So it was an act of faith that Moses had where he leaned on the Lord, and he knew that whatever attractions and pleasures Pharaoh's palace could offer him, they were of no significance, because he knew he had to live before God. He knew he had to live to please God. And his love for God was more than his love for Pharaoh's palace, his love for the pleasures of sin or the treasures of Egypt. And no wonder he was able to shun all of them because of that faith he had, because of that deep love he had for the Lord. And another thing that stands out here is, like I said in the beginning, Moses was burdened for his, fellow Hebrew brothers and sisters. When they were being abused, when they were being, oppressed by the Egyptians, Moses was not happy with it. He was burdened. He was upset about it. He tried to intervene. He did whatever he felt he could do. And that's why he ended up, killing someone, because he felt it was not right. And that's something that we must learn to ask God to give us a burden. When the Lord taught us to pray, it was never about, Lord, give me my bread, forgive me of my sins, or lead me not into temptation. It's always about, give us this day our daily bread, forgive us from our sins. He wants us to be burdened for each other. It could be our family, it could be a circle that he may have put us in. And that's what we can learn from Moses. Moses genuinely had a burden for his fellow brothers and sisters, the Israelites. And we can learn to ask God to not be so self-centered and not be so selfish, thinking about only our needs, but also be able to be burdened for the needs of others. And again, another important lesson like we learn here is we can ask God that we will have faith, that in faith we will be able to reject the pleasures of sin, the desires of this world, the treasures of this world, money and fame and riches and the honor of the world, which can be so appeasing to us in this day and age. We can learn to reject them in faith, not by what we can see, but in faith, because the Lord means more to us. Living for God means more to us. And therefore, all these passing pleasures of sin and the treasures of the world, which will all one day matter for nothing, we can learn to reject them, just like Moses did. I'll close with the usual credits. All the pictures we saw in today's story are from freebibleimages.org. The video that we saw earlier was from Share Faith Kids. And a lot of the points and the commentaries I've personally learned from this story are from messages of Brother Zach Poonen. You can go to cfcindia.com where you can read more and go through a lot of message series that you'll find there. One of the ones that I've been personally blessed by is the Through the Bible series, which is an audio and a video series, which you can easily go through and understand what the Lord, wants us to learn and understand from every book of the Bible. Thank you, and God bless you.